Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the third session of Foundations of Economic Thought, hosted by the Penn Initiative for the Study of Markets at the University of Pennsylvania. As a reminder, today's session will last approximately 90 minutes, and the lecture will run for the first hour or something like that, followed by some questions. You're welcome to submit them anytime through the Zoom's Q&A function, but we will address them at the end. We are pleased to welcome our first invited speaker, Professor of Economics Daniel Klein from George Mason University, where he leads the program on Smithian political economy. He's also affiliated with the Ratio Institute in Stockholm, and he is the editor-in-chief of Econ Journal Watch. He has published recently two open access books on Smithian morals, and central notions of Smithian liberalism by CL Press. Today's presentation by him will explore more or less the development of liberal thought in the wake of Adam Smith's context, Adam Smith's role as moral and political authority, some key concepts from the Wealth of Nations and the theory of moral sentiments, and basically the emergence of liberty as a guiding principle in his political economy. So let's start, Professor Klein.
Thank you so much, Fernando, and thanks for having me. Thank you, Enrique and Jacob. I attended Jacob's fine lecture on Tuesday that provided a nice broad background to both Smith's context and some of the main ideas of the Wealth of Nations. Um, so I've got, like Fernando says, some main themes in mind about Smith as I would say something of a culmination of an arc of liberalism, a kind of a leading voice and figure, even symbol of what was known as Western liberalism. Now, the word liberal, of course, has undergone changes since Smith's time, but I'm going to talk about what it meant when he used liberal in a political way. But going back even further, broader. By the way, you might notice I have a cut on I have this on my pinky. I sliced my pinky slicing tomatoes, and it's a little ironic because there's a very famous passage in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, this one, um, which is about a person sacrificing their pinky for the good of others. I just was slicing tomatoes, but I can't help thinking of that. Anyhow, I want to share just a little outline that'll help me at least, and a few words on the page might help you. Um, as Fernando mentioned, here are a couple of books which are open access, recent books of mine on Smith and Smithian stuff. But here, right here, sort of points 1 through 4 are this very broad narrative, some of the broad narrative I want to place Smith within. Okay. Um, and there is a remarkable development of the last 500 years. I think the printing press is a very significant starting point, and I think this came up yesterday, it was mentioned in Jacob's session, um, where people look for meaning. People care about, of course, material well-being, but assuming that people can sustain themselves pretty securely, their main concerns turn to moral and intellectual purpose, meaning, and those kinds of things. And that is where, of course, religion has played such a large role in human history. Religion, of course, was much more hand in glove with the government or the state, in as much as we had governments throughout hundreds and hundreds of years. And so, but state and church were very much united in and led the whole sense of human meaning and purpose and culture and what life meant and what you should do with your life and what's proper and what's improper. Um, and people didn't have too many sources when they were illiterate and there wasn't any reading material. They just had their local social interaction, their church, and so forth. The printing press is really a very significant moment where things get broken open. And now authors could offer very different interpretations of life, of the world, of God, of Scripture. And so all of a sudden, there's a great deal of disjointedness and among interpretations of the world, competition among interpretations of the world. And of course, in Western Europe, um, we have the Protestants who object to the Catholic Church's monopoly on the whole sense of higher things in life, the things that give life meaning, the godly things. I mean, everybody still's for God, and I really like the whole pattern of a God view of human life and of ethics, and Smith's moral system fits that monotheistic, benevolent monotheistic pattern. He follows it very closely or even explicitly. However, we have different notions about what God likes and approves of. And Luther had different notions than the Catholic Church. And then Calvin and Zwingli and so on had somewhat different notions from each other, as well as the Catholic Church. And there were wars, religious wars, for a long time, especially in the 16th and 17th century. Um, those wars weren't only about religion, of course, they were also about political powers and alliances and the balance of power and things like that. But they were shot through with religious connections. And it went awful, as you probably know. The 30 Years' War, from especially in the Central Europe, from 1618 to 1648, that's the 30 years of the 30 Years' War, was an especially bad time. And coming at the end of that is Westphalia, the Treaty of Westphalia, when things are kind of, it seems like after, 150 years or so, or of the printing press and this commotion from all of this competing interpretation about life and higher meaning, a new kind of attitude develops, which is that, and Grotius is important in this. The old attitude was that the government was very connected to the church in leading and tending the things that gave life meaning and purpose, and what telling you what God approves and disapproves of, and so on. And that led to all of this chaos and destruction and death, people fighting over it. So the new attitude was maybe the government shouldn't lead and focus on the higher things, like getting us to the higher things. Rather, maybe what the government should focus on is protecting us from the worst things, the bad lower things. In other words, violence, murder, theft, and so on. And so this was the idea that the government refocuses from kind of leading us in the meaning of life, like they're our guru, to the government protecting us so that each of us can then, in our own way, pursue higher things, the pursuit of happiness, like in the Declaration of Independence, while as long as we each protect each other's basic rights, not their, you know, it's not about delivering people to beautification, but protecting them against threats. Um, and this new attitude goes with this developing body of thought about these basic rights, these kind of more grammar like a basic grammar of morals. of protecting people's property and freedom of association. And Smith himself uses grammar as an analogy for these basic rights of property, protecting your neighbor from encroachments, from violations of his person, property, or promises due, which is to say, things that people owe him through contracts. So a very basic grammar. Now, if you think about it, grammar gives us basic rules about writing on a page, but it doesn't actually tell us what to put on a blank piece of paper. It just tells us to be grammatical. And that's kind of what this commutative justice, this basic form of justice, is. It's saying, it doesn't tell you what is a becoming way of life, what is a meaningful, fulfilling, godly way of life. It just says, here are the basics you got to do, and that we will enforce against, we being society and the government, of like not messing with your neighbor's stuff, essentially. But it doesn't tell you what to do with your stuff. It doesn't really tell you how to go forward in life. So it's a whole shift from helping people rise up, and leading the higher things, telling them what to do with their lives, to not telling them what to do with their lives so long as they keep within the social grammar. And so this really births the idea of liberty. This commutative justice is not messing with your neighbor's stuff. You can flip that around to liberty. Others not messing with your stuff. And in particular, the government not messing with your stuff. Now, governments, by their nature, mess with your stuff. In fact, when you stop and think about it, governments are defined by messing, by doing things which, if our neighbor tried or did, would be criminal. If your neighbor tried to tax you, that would be called extortion or robbery. If your neighbor tried to, tell you what you can and can't do with your property, or what wage rates you can pay, or what you can buy or not buy, that would be considered assault or something like that. But the government does that routinely in a way very different than ordinary criminals, because they put it up on a big website and they say, here are the things which we are telling you you can't do. And here are the taxes which we are telling you you have to pay us, or we will come and initiate coercion against you. That's not how robbers work. They don't put up a website and say, "Oh, at 3 a.m. tonight, I'm going to break into your car and steal, what you've got in your trunk." Um, so government is different than crime, but it is also the initiation of coercion. But under this new philosophy, and Smith called it the liberal plan, the government should keep its hands largely to itself. It does collect taxes, impose taxes. It does do some intervention and regulation, but Smith made this big case for for there being a strong presumption of liberty, which I talk about down here, which I have down here, that the presumption should be, as long as people stick within the social grammar, that is to say, not mess with their neighbor's stuff, they should be allowed to do what they like. It's a presumption. It's not an absolute axiom. It's like the presumption of innocence. With the presumption of innocence, it's presumed that the defendant is innocent, and it is up to the prosecution to prove. The burden of proof is on the prosecution to overturn that presumption. And similarly, Smith's liberal philosophy is that liberty gets the presumption, and if you're going to make a case to violate or contravene liberty, you've got to overcome this presumption. You've got the burden of proof. And Smith generally felt that a lot of the arguments, like the mercantilist policies that Jacob talked about, really were not justifiable. They did not overcome that burden of proof. And so they actually were not good policy. And he called for a repeal of a lot of those those policies, those interventionist, protectionist, monopolistic policies. So Smith fits into this whole arc, and he was very much a jurisprudence guy. Um, there's this thick two sets of his lectures on jurisprudence, which are very informative, and he also talks about jurisprudential notions in this great book. It's not showing up on the screen because of the, yeah, anyway, theory of moral sentiments. Um, And so he's very much in this Grotius tradition, in this whole line of jurisprudence thinkers, and then flipping that, as this whole tradition does, the justice of not messing with your neighbor's stuff, the duty of not messing with your neighbor's stuff, to the right of others of not messing with your stuff. That is to say, your right to have others not mess with your stuff, especially the government or liberty. Okay. This is very much a kind of a crystallization of the last 500 years. And then when we got this liberal attitude for government and economic policy, we got the whole invigoration of markets, the whole moral authorization of markets, of the pursuit of honest income. And then finally, especially at the beginning of the 19th century, the hockey stick blade, the Great Enrichment. So this is the gestation of the Great Enrichment. This is what made it all possible. This is the liberal arc. Let me just say a little bit more about Smith as a moral authority. The first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, very much established him as a moral philosopher. This is a book about virtue. This is a book about your duties to your neighbor and to everybody else you interact with. So it's a very moral book. So he had a lot of moral stature. He wasn't a minister, but he was like one in a way. In a way, he's kind of like an intellectual cleric. And so he's got a great deal of moral authority. This was well regarded. And so then in 1776, he comes out with, the two-volume Wealth of Nations. And what does this moral authority tell us? He morally authorizes, first of all, you in your private life, that it's fine, that God approves of the pursuit of honest income. He develops all these rich arguments and illustrations of, you know what, by pursuing honest, that's the grammar, honest income, you do that by delivering value, by delivering something that people are willing to voluntarily pay for. That's how you get your income or profit. And so this honest profit comes from serving people's wants, serving people, serving society, serving God's creatures, serving God. Okay. And this comes right out of the Christian ministers who were developing this attitude in the Protestant vein, especially like Baxter, and like Perkins and others leading up into this, other set of authors in the 18th century, some of them clerics and religious, and some of them more non-religious, like David Hume, for example, or Daniel Defoe. But this is like when this whole this whole moral basis for letting people pursue their own interests their own way was very much the dominant kind of doctrine of the public philosophy, especially in Britain, especially in Scotland. So it's really a fantastic and amazing development. And that very school and body of thought super influenced the American founding. I mean, the American founding happens just at this time. I mean, the Declaration of Independence was a couple of months after this appeared in 1776. Um, and so we got a whole new continental country, in the from the Constitutional Convention in the late 80s, 1780s, that kind of represented this whole new thing. I know it had all of its problems and failures, like notably slavery, and that was a kind of compromise that the founding fathers didn't like and didn't quite know what to do about at the time. Um, so obviously, it wasn't some complete, liberal in the Smithian sense a regime or setup or country or society. Obviously not. But there was an ascendancy of that, and there was a public philosophy, and even the political leaders knew that the huge, failures and blemishes like slavery, most of them anyway, um, felt like, yeah, this is just like a problem we're going to have to learn to work through and overcome in time. Um, so that's what this is all. This is how I see it all. Now, I want to mention that the word liberal has a very old history. It means going back centuries and centuries, even back to ancient times in Latin, and it meant kind of generous, um, permissive. It also had the connotation of the arts and sciences which free men pursued and should pursue. And that's how we have the notion of the liberal arts and the liberal sciences. So it had these non-political meanings for a long time, but it was in the 1770s that the word liberal took on this political meaning when it was applied to these political concepts of liberal principles, liberal policy, liberal system, liberal government, liberal plan. And you can see here, these are engrams of those 2 grams. These are figures, graphs of those 2 grams, and they just explode all together like a great blossoming in the 1770s. Right in here would be the Wealth of Nations, which was very significant in participating in this. And since Wealth of Nations itself was such an influential and successful book, launching this. So this is so Smithian liberalism, which is sometimes called classical liberalism, the original liberalism, if you like, political liberalism 1.0, is very much, as Smith put it, allowing every man to pursue his own interest, his own way. That's very much at the heart of it. It's actually a very, very government skeptical philosophy. It's saying, look, the knowledge is separate, is out there, dispersed among society. We want individual parts to kind of take care of themselves, acting on their own special local knowledge of the opportunities, constraints, desires in the local situation. Um, and there's a whole evolutionary and selective process in an open free enterprise system that's healthy, that has an invisible hand aspect to it. And so it's really best for the government to lay off and let that happen, especially because the government doesn't have good knowledge. It doesn't have good incentives. And in fact, it can very much be misdirected towards very bad purposes. Basically dishonest ways of getting income, exploitative ways of getting income. Um, Again, government has the power of coercion, and that's a very dangerous power. So you don't want to give this power. You want to try to keep this power within tight limits, is basically the idea. And government doesn't have like an invisible hand mechanism to make it work right nearly as much as the free enterprise system does. So Smith sustained this presumption of liberty in the wealth of nations. He made exceptions, and he definitely, like Jacob said, favored and presupposed the existence of a national state, a nation state, a sort of integration of the jural rules where coercive power was exercised. It could have different levels, just like we have town, state, and federal government in the United States. It could have even different court systems, but they are integrated and they respect each other's domains, and so it's all one sort of jural or law type system. So that's the very broad sense, my sense of Adam Smith and how I ask you to think about him. And it's like a whole figure and prophet in a way of our civilization, of our remarkable civilization. Um, Now, what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about the first chapter, which Jacob referred to. The pin factory and the woolen coat are the two highlights in this first chapter about the division of labor. Um, because I think it's really interesting, and there's some really interesting, there's a couple of very interesting, important points or lessons I think to be drawn right from that first chapter. Um, so he says that improvement and wealth comes with the division of labor. And he starts illustrating this in the second paragraph of the chapter. He says, imagine that all the different branches of work are collected into the same workhouse and placed at once under the view of the spectator. So you're imagining a place like a factory with a spectator, and the spectator is watching what happens in the factory. This is one of two occurrences of the word spectator in the Wealth of Nations. I'm into this kind of textual thing. The word spectator is super fundamental in this book. And the impartial spectator, in its highest sense, is an ethical concept in his whole ethical system. And it's basically like God. And it's super important. And here he mentions spectator in the second paragraph of the first chapter. And the second from last paragraph, that is to say, yeah, the second from last paragraph of the last chapter, he mentioned spectator in at the end of volume two. So I don't think that's an accident. So, because he wants to fit, as Jacob said, this whole wealth of nations is actually an extension or annex of his ethical system. So he's talking about this factory. It's a pin factory under the view of a spectator. Um, yeah, the pin maker. Um, and then he describes a bit. He says, first of all, as Jacob mentioned, that if somebody didn't know much about this and was just coming to the production and had to work by himself, he could scarcely make a few pins in a day. But in the way in which this business is now carried on, not only the whole work is a peculiar trade, but it is divided into a number of branches, of which the greater part are likewise peculiar trades. One man draws out the wire, another straights it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head. To make the head requires two or three distinct operations. To put it on is a peculiar business. To whiten the pins is another. It is even a trade by itself to put them into the paper. And the important business of making a pin is in this manner divided into about 18 distinct operations. And by dividing labor this way, so that each person focuses, so rapidly on the action, the task. They make some 48,000 pins in a day. So tremendous economies of scale through this division of labor. And he then goes and talks about what it is about the division of labor that generates this productivity. And as Jacob had mentioned, he he talks about getting better at like let's say cutting the wire with practice, sort of learning by doing. He also talks about not having to switch tasks, like Jacob mentioned. And then the third one is the invention of machines and new methods that come from the division of labor, more powerful methods of doing all these things. I won't go into that. I want to then jump to the end of the book. No, let me just, before I jump to the end, one thing about the pin factory. Now, you're all economists or econ students. We've got this spectator looking down at the pin factory. Let's say he's up there on the rafters looking down and seeing all this. One guy pulls out the wire, the next one cuts it, the next one straights it. Um, what does this spectator find beautiful? What is beautiful to the spectator? First of all, who's a natural person to associate with the spectator? Well, I don't know if you guys could answer, but so I'll answer my own question. The owner, right? The residual claimant, the guy who meets payroll, the guy who claims the residual. The residual is what's left after you get your revenues from the buyers of the pins and you pay out all your costs for producing the pins, and then there's a residual. If it's positive, we call it profit. If it's negative, we call it loss. And the owner claims it, profit or loss, residual claimant. Well, what to that owner is beautiful? Profit and more profit. Now, that's not the only thing that's beautiful. There's things other than, the final dollar amount at the end of the month. There's other things that are beautiful. Smith does not deny that. He wants good relations. He wants love among his workplace. He wants respect in the community. He wants to treat his neighbor right. So I'm not saying it's only profit, but it's a very focal piece of what that guy finds beautiful. Okay? And so you see, in the free enterprise system, it's not that every company ought to be focused exclusively on profit, but there's nothing else that's nearly as focal as that. The other things turn out to be vaguer and harder to validate and verify and make people accountable for. And so profit is significant as a kind of criterion for business performance. It's not the only thing by any means. Ethics is always about doing the good for the whole in the broadest sense, but it is a focal something. It's better to have a focus on something than to have nothing to focus on. That's when real chicanery and corruption sets in, when it's a bunch of BS that people say they're doing and you can't make them accountable. Profit, at least, is sort of accountable and stuff. So that's important because when he comes to the woolen coat, he's then again talking about the division of labor, but now it's fascinatingly broken wide open. He says, sorry, let me just get there. Ba, 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 ba. Yes. So at the end of the chapter, he's got this long last paragraph. Um, Observe the accommodation of the most common day laborer. And he says, such as a woolen coat. Okay. He says, the woolen coat, which covers the day laborer, as coarse and rough as it may appear, is the produce of the joint labor of a great multitude of workmen. And then he starts illustrating it with concretes. And that concrete list of concrete illustrations goes on for like a whole one of these big pages. The shepherd, the sorter of the wool comber or carder, the dyer, the scribbler, the spinner, the weaver, the fuller, the dresser, with many others, must all join their different arts in order to complete this homely production. How many merchants and carriers, besides, must have been employed in transporting the materials, uh, who often live in a very distant part of the country? Exclamation point. How much commerce and navigation in particular, how many shipbuilders, sailors, sailmakers, rope makers must have been employed in order to bring together the different drugs made use of by the dyer, which often come from the remotest corners of the world. Exclamation point. What a variety of labor, too, is necessary in order to produce the tools of the meanest of those workmen! Exclamation point. And he goes on and on still about this. And he's saying that this vast worldwide system, um, again, takes advantage of the division of labor and all of its benefits and brings woolen coats now to 18th century people in Britain, for even a common day laborer, affordable prices, at affordable prices. And so this is the kind of magic. And then the question is, how is all this get coordinated? And he goes on in the book to talk about the free enterprise system, profit and loss, competition, pricing, and so on. But here we have to think of the spectator looking on to this whole set of activities. This whole set of activities is worldwide. It's not some owner of a pin factory. Who sees the whole world? God. God, the impartial spectator. And what is the criterion here? Well, it's about the goodness for the whole of humankind, the good of the whole, benevolence, universal benevolence. And here we don't have a focal benchmark like the pin factory owner did. The pin factory owner had the benchmark of profitability. Here we're thinking about what God finds beautiful, and it's the well-being of everybody. It's not one person's profit. And so it's a lot harder for us to read and get a grip on and conceptualize. And so then we all come up with these different ideas about what exactly is the good of the whole, what exactly advances us toward the good, whatever the good is. And so it's much more difficult. And he's making the case in this, great two-volume work that, look, guys, in Europe here, some of us here in these different things we now call countries have developed a stable political order. These are coming to be called nation states. And let's run with that. And let's try to make it a liberal nation state. And here's why I think liberal policy for the economy and the society in general is actually what will produce what God finds beautiful. He's like now the God is now the spectator of the whole, the big society. And so it's kind of like he's scaled up the spectator from the pin factory to the economy, if you like, even the world economy. And so that's kind of the neat thing he's doing right in chapter one. Right in chapter one. He's given you like this whole sense of seeing the beauty of the whole thing. So I'll quit there and open up for questions.
So thank you, Professor Klein. So we have a couple of questions already. So let's
Mhm.
start. Prerna asks, from what I understand, liberalism arose from the principle of duty to one's neighbors and toward their stuff, and curtailments of actions that hurt them and their stuff. Who has the moral authority to declare which stuff is whose? I guess the question is, what arguments underpins the moral authority of private property?
That's a great question, and it's a question that I feel that Smith and that whole jurisprudence tradition dealt with in great detail and gave good answers to. Um, it's not that tricky. We have a notion about our neighbor's stuff that bubble. Look, first of all, we have a notion of owning ourselves, which is supernatural to human beings. I think a proper way to think about the human being is that you are a soul who owns your person. Like this cut finger that I told you about. It's mine. And what makes it mine? Why is it mine? There's very special connection between, this, let's do this finger so you can actually see it. There's a very special connection between this material right here and my will or soul, which, the will and the soul would be very interconnected. Because I have a very special ability, my will does, to control and affect this pinky. Like this pinky really wouldn't do you much good if it became yours. You couldn't do that much with it. You could try to tell me, order me around, but I may not be very cooperative, and that's going to involve all sorts of other problems of having me as yours. And the whole notion of like one soul owning someone else's person is, I think, naturally repugnant to human beings, even back 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago. In the small bands that we evolved in, people didn't enslave each other. They did not have the technology to enslave each other. Look at animals, they don't enslave each other. And so it's very natural for us to develop ownership as a sense of self-ownership of our person. Okay. We have a very special knowledge and control of our bodies and persons. Now, this that's called ownership. Okay. And that's the prototype, the archetype of ownership is self-ownership of your person. That principle of ownership gets extended through history, and we learn to extend it to other material objects like books and like clothing. First, it was your things you immediately possessed, like you had in your immediate possession. And again, there's special relationships you have with your immediate possessions and advantages you have in defending them that make that natural. And conventions and culture arise about owning these different kinds of objects, like I own this coffee cup. Now, I think it's very natural, and it's not even that dependent on government. It comes up through band and tribal society, and it gets developed, and you know, society gets more complex, and eventually people propertize land. And what is the basis for saying it's mine rather than yours? There's different, sources of that ownership. One is homesteading or occupation of unowned land. One is long usage, or what's called prescription after long, long usage when whoever else may have once owned it, it seems to have disappeared and is lost or dead or something. There's accession, like if my cow has a calf, that calf is mine too. There's transfer, there's trade. That's very important, obviously, for economics. So, and there's succession, of course, as well. That is, I leave it to my heirs when I die. So these guys talked about all this, and it's very, very natural, and it's not that mysterious, and it developed in a very super way in in civilizations generally. It's not just Western civilization. And so, listen, that's ownership. And when you think about it, it is natural. It's like a grammar. And so, listen. So here's the thing: we have a sense of that ownership in relation to our neighbor, and we wouldn't go and steal their stuff. And so when we see the government doing something which our neighbor would be criminal to do, that's a violation of liberty. I mean, we apply the rules that we apply to our neighbor to judge, to say whether or not the government is intervening or not. And so I think it's not that mysterious. I think it's really pretty natural. There are some differences in grammars around the world, and there's some differences in property rules in different societies in different periods of history. But whatever the rules are between neighbors provides a basis for saying whether or not the government is according people liberty or not. And again, it's not that the government should always respect everybody's liberty. Sometimes the government has to do things that violate liberty, but at least, you know it's a violation of liberty because if my neighbor did it, it would be criminal. I hope that
Yeah.
helps.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions regarding religion, which I will try to summarize.
Sure.
First, was Smith a devout Christian? And related to that, do Smith's theory of moral sentiments require the concept of God? Can people be moral even if they are not religious?
Those are great questions. The second one is a bigger and challenging question. Does Smithian ethics depend on theism? I personally would not say so. I myself am agnostic, by the way. I'm basically like a Christian hugger. And I hope Christians are right, or I hope theists are right, and there's a benevolent God and all that. I just can't say that like I'm all there and actually like affirming the truth of any particular theism, but I'm open to it and I'm persuaded that it's possible. Um, I think the whole pattern of that monotheistic thought and a God or godlike being or spectator is essential to proper ethics and definitely to Smithian ethics. So, does it depend on theism? Let's put it this way, it depends on the whole pattern of theistic thought. Whether in the end you actually have to affirm, divine providence and the whole doctrine of theism, as opposed to just affirm the worthiness of the whole pattern that would give rise to. That's that always subtle, tricky question. That's the one that Jordan Peterson always has trouble answering, right? Is he a Christian or is he a theist or not? But so you do need that whole pattern of thought for Smithian for Smith's ethics, the theory of moral sentiments. The impartial spectator, in the highest sense, is God or a God-like being, even if it's kind of an allegorical being. Now, was Smith himself a, a devout Christian? Um, We don't know, oddly enough. And it's kind of remarkable that this guy was so Sphinx-like in so many respects and managed to make himself mysterious in that way and in other ways. Um, there are explicit affirmations of divine providence in this book. And so he certainly sounds like he's a theist. There's some things that make him sound Christian as well, in particular. There are other things about his work and about the way he revised his work and things he said in correspondence and being good friends with David Hume, who was an agnostic, which give plausibility to the theory that he was more like David Hume, perhaps, than really a devout Christian. And we really, honestly, I don't know. Honestly, I don't have a very super strong opinion about that.
Thank you. Another question related to another aspect of Smith's works. Leonardo asked more or less about the Smithian project. So we know a lot about Smith as an economist and how other economists in his time and later on, and even today, talk about him in terms of his economics. But is there anybody else that followed his agenda on moral philosophy, or is this just a completed project that just died off?
Um, and it's another really interesting question. Um, After Smith died in 1790, this this book actually lost favor precipitously and rather fell into oblivion. And in fact, stayed in oblivion, like you put it, Fernando, died off for maybe 170 years or so. Kind of remarkable. It has made a very, very strong comeback in the last 40 years. So now this is a very hot book. Attitudes about this have changed greatly. And I don't think you can think of too many books that were well received when they first came out, went through over 100 years of oblivion, and then came back and became very popular. But that is what we're seeing with this, and it raises interesting questions about why that would happen. So this did fall off. This was very, very well regarded throughout ever since it was published. And for that whole period of oblivion, Smith was thought to have been, mainly the author of this, and then he also wrote some book that nobody read and wasn't really very good, they thought. But actually, I think The Theory of Moral Sentiments is his greater work, and he thought it was his greater work. Um, so I think this book is a super subtle, super rich, and kind of tricky book, which fell out of favor not because it's not worthwhile and not a great book, but more because like our civilization went wrong, believe it or not. Like it was their fault, not Smith's fault, that it fell out of favor. That's my own personal view.
Another question regarding the theory of moral sentiments. The question is, how can we fine-tune our perception of self with the impartial spectator? The end of the book is quite dismal in its portrayal of the corruption of moral sentiments and the methods for overcoming it.
Um, I'm not sure what is meant by the end of the book being dismal. Um, so the question is, how can we use the impartial spectator notion to what? To make sure that society goes in the right direction or something?
Yeah, to
Or
moderate our own morals, right? So if we model ourselves, I mean, this is the way in which I
mm,
interpret the question. If we model
yeah,
ourselves in today's world and we see a lot of violence, a lot of people doing bad
yeah,
stuff,
yeah.
then we would not be also attuned to that.
Yeah, it's very challenging. And I don't think Smith is promising that morals will just go upward and be progressive in the sense of progressing towards better things. Um, but I don't think the question is, how do we become more virtuous ourselves? And by what path do we hope others become and society generally become more virtuous? And I just think that what he has to offer is the best game in town, but it's no guarantee. There are no guarantees, and it's no easy correction to, the world's troubles and vices, or each of our own vices. Um, it's a very great challenge. I mean, you can think of this in terms of Christianity and fallen man and being constantly tempted to the wrong path. And so all of life is a great challenge. And how do you meet that challenge? Well, I think all of Christianity and all of theism generally um, says you got to go through the conscience. The conscience, Smith said, is the representative of the impartial spectator. It's not, your conscience is not necessarily a great representative, um, but it can be better and good, and the only way up is through the conscience. So the conscience plays a very big role in this. Yeah, I don't know what else to say.
A similar question by Fernando asks, What would be in Smith's view the basic grammar for profit? So is profit virtuous in his morals? And how could he identify issues like fraud and embezzlement?
Um, Honest profit. I would say that that Wealth of Nations develops an argument that honest profit, not embezzlement profit, honest profit, is presumptively virtuous. It's not necessarily, it's not always and 100%, but like first of all, honest profit could come by honestly selling a product that you know is not actually a good product or a product that's good for people. I mean, this is especially true in culture. You know, if you just produce pornography and stuff that's honest and it's profitable, is it good? I don't know, not really. You know, if you just, you know, you can honestly produce cocaine. I mean, it's like, here, it's
Yeah.
cocaine. Honest, honest. Here's my honest cocaine. Give me your honest dollar and profit. But is selling cocaine, so it's not always virtuous by any means, but presumptively, like usually. Because look, the two people are voluntarily getting what the other person is honestly providing. So you got to let people, just like you got to rely on your conscience. You got to let people, you know, understand and pursue their own interests. And if they're making mistakes, like doing too much cocaine or pornography, like you hope that the reasons those things are bad will correct them. I mean, you know, you got to hope that people correct themselves. Um, so yes, I would say he gives a presumption to honest profit as as virtuous, at least at least innocent, if not actually praiseworthy. So that's why this book and this whole culture of economics actually at this time very much invigorated commerce because it kind of gave a green light to going out and being basically ambitious for honest profit. And that really gives a green light to innovation, doing things new and different. And if people are upset or surprised, saying, "Hey, man, it's honest profit." We got the clerics and the priests and Adam Smith all saying that God likes it if it makes money, because the money means that God's creatures are paying for what I'm making. And God wants to see his creatures comfortable and happy. And that's why they bought my product. And so you see, it really gives a big green light to innovation. And innovation, of course, is the whole essence of the hockey stick. You
Mm.
see, once you give that invigoration to innovation, that's when things really start exploding. And then the other big, you know, moral authority, moral authorization is, hey, lawmaker, let people pursue honest income. Free markets, okay? Free society. Let them do it. Let them do it. And then people go for it, man. Have your go at it.
Curtis then asks, when did economists stop thinking about morals or morality? This was
In
obviously
the
important for Smith, but not for the other ones.
Yeah, I would say this is something that really changes after Smith's death. It's a really great question. And it's sad. It's very sad. And but it's a big change that happens in the generations, I would say, after Smith's death. Something that happens, something that's kind of unfortunate from the 18th century Enlightenment is that some people get the wrong idea that um, moral philosophy can be turned into separate and distinct areas of study, which then just focus on their own little parts of study and then somehow trade with each other. so that altogether this all works out in an invisible hand kind of way. But I don't think that's the way culture and science works. And I actually don't think Smith thought had great confidence in that either. Um, but what happens is you get these development of more separate and distinct disciplines in the social sciences. Um, and then the economists wanted to be the expert and lead economists. They didn't know anything particularly about morals or theology, but hey, no, I'm an economist, so that's not my responsibility. And I just want to be the leading and famous leader of this science we call economics. And so this attitude led people to kind of segment or separate these different areas of human study from the bigger moral question of virtue and morals. And so, yeah, that really started happening right after Smith's time, I'd say, unfortunately. It also has to do with the decline of religion because people threw the baby out. Like a lot of people said, hey, listen, your church isn't for me. I don't really like your religious doctrines. But then they threw the baby of kind of like the whole pattern of moral religious thought out with the bathwater of like maybe the church in the neighborhood they didn't like. Um, and they started thinking somehow that they could get away from um, ethical notions about what a benevolent beholder would find beautiful, which I think was a mistake.
Marcelo then asks, what's your opinion about the Das Adam Smith problem, the idea proposed by some German philosophers that the ideas on the theory of moral sentiments are incompatible with the ideas of the wealth of nations?
Great question. Basically, I don't think they're incompatible at all. And you just got to see that it's partly Smith turning to different kinds of questions and problems. Um, that's one reason the two works do read and feel different, very different. And they really do read and feel quite different. There are huge differences in the kinds of language that he uses in the two works, the kinds of metaphors he uses, and so forth. Um, so there is a real striking difference. It's partly, I think, because of the different subject areas that he's treating, but also I actually think he made a point of being different, making the two stylistically different that way. Almost like he wanted to create Das Adam Smith problem. He's that kind of guy. He creates puzzles. He wants us to be talking about him 200 years after his death. I swear. I've no doubt about this. And he succeeded, as you can see. Um, so part of it is that he did make the two works really quite different in their feeling and voice. Um, but I don't think there's a fundamental difference at all. It's all part of one mind, quite integrated mind.
Now we have a question by Tolga, which I'm not sure what she's talking about, referring to in your talk, but she says, are we talking about the deepening or the emergence of the division of labor? I guess we could talk about the division of labor in a more general sense before industrial production. Is it technology that determines the deepening or emergence, or is it the shift towards production for the market?
Um, yeah, I think both technology is a factor and a part of a story about changes in the division of labor or ways to even formulate what the division of labor is and how it changes. Technology and producing more for markets and perhaps more for international markets and so forth, thanks to both transportation, but also to liberalization, to freedom to trade across markets, a freedom that politicians today are increasingly denying us under all sorts of for all sorts of reasons. Not even that economic. A lot of it's just military geopolitical sanctioning of each other. That's what these 500% tariffs are, is they're sanctions. Um, it's basically geopolitical warfare. But anyway, um, so so yeah, and whether you call it a broadening of the division of labor, he used the word extension rather than deepening. Um, yeah, I'm not quite sure how best to speak of it. Um, yeah, I'm not quite sure else what the questioner is trying to get at. But technology is real important in it. As Smith noted, it was the third of the three, new machines, he said.
Okay, now we have two questions on liberalism as a whole. Pablo asks, what's the main difference between liberalism in Smith and today's liberalism? And then Carl asks, to what extent do you think Adam Smith influenced or was influenced by French liberals like Benjamin Constant, Germain de Staël, and François Guizot?
Well, those three French people are all after Smith. I mean, I guess they overlap, but they're all younger than Smith. I'm not sure Guizot and Smith overlap at all. Um, so Smith influenced them. Smith powerfully influenced Constant and probably Guizot as well. I don't really know. Um, but all of those liberals are the older, to go more for now to the first question, are the older liberals, the classical liberals, I'd say. And so how does that liberalism differ from North American liberalism of the 20th and 21st century? In other words, what's called liberal, like the Liberal Party in Canada, like Justin Trudeau, or the Democratic Party in the United States, who, they tend to be more called the liberals. Um, it's a huge difference. It's almost turning something on its head, I would say, because I think those are generally parties of the left, and I do think the left tend towards sentiments and agendas that rather than spelling the reduction in the governmentalization of society, the governmentalization of social affairs, actually spells the increase in governmentalization. Um, so, whereas the old liberalism, I think, was opposed to bigger government or governmentalizing affairs, um, it switched, at least in certain parts of the world. Um, it really switched in North America, especially. That's where this new 20th century meaning of liberal really, especially caught on. And then the North America exported it and has been exporting that idea of, that definition or meaning of liberalism to the whole world, partly because of the huge influence of the United States and of the English language as the new lingua franca of so much of the world. Um, by the way, this change happened at the end of the 19th century. It really happens at the end of the 19th century and then comes on strong in North America under FDR in particular. He made a point of making this change. He actually had almost like a scheme of using language, just changing the language. And that really worked. And what he did is he pitted liberal versus conservative, which is unfortunately, the way politics is so often formulated nowadays. Um, so there's a huge change in the word liberal from the end of the 19th century into the 20th century and down to today.
Now we have other questions on religion. An attendee asks about, is this all powerful God, which all perfect and certain things are born from the fundamental basis of the concept of the invisible hand? So is God kind of the basis for the invisible hand, or is this just a rational built concept?
Um, so to what extent does is the impartial spectator necessarily also the creator of the universe and all powerful? Is that sort of the question?
Yeah, I think so, more or less.
It's a good question. You know, when we stop and think about it, and this is something I've been talking and writing about, um, there are a number of features of what we call God. And what are some of the big ones? One is super knowledge, okay? You might say omniscience, but I don't actually like the word omniscience because I'm not quite sure it makes sense. But something like more than human knowledge, like superhuman knowledge, obviously. That's one thing. Another thing is universal benevolence, a kind of feeling that the God's main interest is like our well-being, like the whole of humankind's, including future generations' well-being. That's different than us. That's a very significant one. One is divine providence, that is to say, creation, the creator of the universe. Another one are ideas about the eternal, such as the afterlife. And another thing about the eternal is divine justice, that in the eternal, justice is done to us. It may not happen to us during our lifetime here on in this world, but it's coming. So there's all these different features. And does Smith's impartial spectator construct of a universal super knowledgeable beholder require all of them? I would say, strictly speaking, no. And that the main things it requires is the super knowledge and the universal benevolence. I don't think, like, for example, the divine providence is as necessary. It's kind of a natural thing to throw in. After all, why would this spectator love the world and its creatures so much? Maybe because he made it. He made them. He's the creator. Kind of explains. I mean, it kind of fits. So it kind of works as a whole package, which if you're going to teach it to children, is like a very good way to get them into the pattern of thought because it's like Santa Claus. It's kind of like it's a way of getting, you know, children to kind of get it, to get the important stuff in like a whole story. So in a way, that's one way to think about, the whole package. But what I think is most important about the package is the super knowledge and the universal benevolence. We have to feel a duty, as it were, to a beholder who knows more and loves more humankind. That to me is like the most important part of God.
So, a related question, Susan asks, I hear Dr. Kleins recommend economists to respect Christian values as essential for the success of classical liberal ideas. Can you confirm that conclusion?
Yes, I totally confirm that. And I don't want to be that specifically Christian. Um, it's just that I'm a little bit more familiar with Christian and I know more about the story about how liberalism comes out of Christianity, particularly from authors like Larry Siedentop, who wrote a great book on this called Inventing the Individual. And it's about the moral intuitions of Christianity, how new and radical they were, and how over many centuries they finally translated into public understandings and public institutions that brought us finally to this liberal period of the last 400 years that we're talking about.
Now, a question more on the institutional side of religion. Michael asks, is it safe to say that Adam Smith helped push Western civilization away from the Catholic notion of charity, underpinning all social relations, and toward a more transactional view of social relations? If so, would not Smith be a better viewed as a destructive force in the Western canon?
Um, and great question and well put. Um, well, a destructive force for a certain take on godliness. I mean, what Smith is saying and that whole tradition that he's part of is transactional doesn't mean ungodly. Like it's maybe the better way of getting people housed and fed and clothed, on especially on a large scale and especially worldwide. Um, and so it's rethinking, what is godly. Um, and so, yeah, it might be destroying one understanding that's based much more on kind of a person to person sense of charity, like direct person to person benevolence or beneficence. Um, but that's not necessarily the most effective way to get people housed and fed and clothed in a massive way. I mean, it's definitely the way you want to do your personal relations in your family and in your neighborhood and whatnot. But there's more too, like our whole responsibility to humankind. And a lot of good comes out of, these pin factories where it's very transactional.
Now we have a couple of questions on the reception of Adam Smith later on in his life, or not in his life, and later on in the 20th century and 19th century.
Mm.
First, Sebastian asks, given that Adam Smith advocated for individual liberty and the invisible hand working for the common man, why has his work been historically co-opted by the elites, and why does it remain largely unclaimed by working class movements?
I think it used to be more claimed by actually in the 19th century, like Richard Cobden in the Anti-Corn Law League, Cobden and Bright and Gladstone. That was very working class oriented. And what the Anti-Corn Law League was about was repealing restrictions on the importation and exportation of grain. Okay, so it was opposing protectionism. It was for free trade. And it was very Smithian and invoked Smith. So I don't think don't let your familiar experience in our own lifetimes, make you think it's only been that since Smith's time. Um, so I do definitely think that the Smithian notions about individual liberty can resonate with ordinary folks and have in the past. And I think during the American founding period and through much of the American history did, in fact, for a long time.
Actually,
Things went crazy at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, in
Actually,
my view.
the follow-up question, now that you mentioned, Brad asks about what was the reception in the United States on Adam Smith ideas, especially he asks about Alexander Hamilton, but we can broaden this to the whole of American founders.
Um, it was considerable, I think, on the American founders. Hamilton is Hamilton, and he's not necessarily like all the other American founders. He is, of course, in some ways. I know a little bit about these guys, but I'm no expert on them. But Hamilton always has his own agenda. He is very interested not only in a stable government, but a strong central government. And he's a bit more inclined towards government leading society, almost like in the old way of government leading the higher things. He's just he's just more that way. And he picked up on things in Smith. He kind of used Smith, I think, somewhat opportunistically to promote some of his government schemes, actually. Not that he was anti-commerce and free markets, but he was a nation builder. He was a kind of an aggressive government builder in a way. But more generally, not Hamilton, but Madison and Jefferson, and others, Ben Franklin, I think Adams, and so on. Thomas Paine. Um, yeah, I think they're very influenced by Smith, but and Smith's whole time and what Smith is part of you know, uh, the moral authorization of the pursuit of honest income, the spontaneous order, the invisible hand ideas, um, the moral basis and integration from the theory of moral sentiments. So yes, they're definitely influenced by Smith, as well as by Smith's friend Hume, by the way. He's quite influential with Madison, for example.
So, two final questions. First, Diego asks about the presumption of liberty. Do you think it still applies in our modern world, in a world where there's so much government interventions in the economy?
Yes, I do, in the sense that I think the case for advancing and maintaining and defending a presumption of liberty is still very strong and perhaps as strong as ever. This pinky is still, it's still like I said, it's been, I mean, things have changed, but I still have control and special knowledge. When I hit this pinky with a hammer, you don't feel it, I feel it. Um, or when I cut it with a tomato knife. Um, so I mean, fundamentally, we're still humankind is still constituted as individual organisms. Okay. And so the whole kind of, you know, basic operating system, the whole fundamental idea of ownership, of we are human beings, we have our own lives to lead. We accumulate our stuff. Some of it we care about more than others. We pursue our stories. I mean, we still are individuals at the end of the day, and we're going to die as individuals. Um, and individual liberty is still, I think, the proper kind of presumption and ideal almost. Again, it's not. I'm not an anarchist. I'm not a 100%. I just think government is a reality and politics is a reality and it's going to involve compromises. My attitude towards government is a little bit like my attitude towards death. It's not negotiable. It's not optional. There's no like overcoming like let's abolish death. Let's repeal death. Um, it's to be managed. And that's kind of my attitude towards politics and government. We got to have less bad government. And I think generally speaking, that means more constrained, more limited, and so on.
Okay, a final question by Prerna, a very philosophical question. And she asks if the good conscience is presumptively a representative of the great benevolent onlooker, but a particular individual's conscience doesn't account for externalities and leads to a divergence of interest between the individual and the great big spectator in the sky, then will still be honest profit. Is the awareness of the externality relevant? This is
I
about
don't
perception of profit. Yeah.
I don't think that those problems with the conscience, which are very real, Smith says your conscience is a representative of the great onlooker, but it doesn't say it's a good representative. And we all know that representatives are not necessarily, I mean, look at our representatives in Congress. Are they very good? They're not very good either, right? Just saying it's a representative, just like the questioner proposes, is not necessarily a good representative. So your conscience could stink or somehow be weak and disregarded, like somehow ineffective. So things go wrong with the conscience for sure, and a conscience like described would be a not a good conscience. But again, the only way upward is through the conscience. So you got to improve your conscience. You can't really say, I'm going to let someone else's conscience be my guide. And if you think about it, that doesn't really make sense because it's like your conscience is saying, I'm going to delegate their conscience. So it's still like your conscience is the principal and then their conscience is the agent. Um, so anyway, I think that's absolutely right that consciences are by no means guarantees, for anything. But I don't think that changes the nature of honest profit. That's more just like the grammar of being honest about what you're selling and keeping your promises and not messing with people's stuff. So I don't think the conscience changes What I mean by mere honest profit. Again, honest profit is not always ethical, but it's presumptively. It's like presumptively, okay, that's fine, green light, go ahead. Like I might not like what you're doing personally, but um, and you know, the questioner mentions externalities, and then you get into the question is of when do externalities turn into messing with someone's stuff? Like how much pollution becomes actually a nuisance, a mess, you know, a common law messing with people's stuff, for example. So there's that margin too.
Well, with that, we have come to an end to the session.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Klein, and thank you, everybody, for attending, for the questions. And well, we will resume next week
Okay.
talking about another philosopher economist. I would say more polarizing even than Smith, which is Karl Marx.
Hmm.
So thank you, everybody, and see you next week.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.